Welcome to TAMA Talks, brought to you by the Torrance Art Museum Advocates. I'm Janine Madden, current TAMA president, and I'd like to thank you for watching. Today's talk will feature work currently on view at the Torrance Art Museum. Baker's Dozen is on view in the main gallery. It's a survey show of 13 artists whose work has made an impression on the curators in this last year. These 13 reflect current directions in Southern Californian contemporary art practices. The show closes on Saturday, June 17th, so be sure to stop by if you're in the area. TAM hours are Tuesday through Saturday, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m., and the museum is located at 3320 Civic Center Drive in Torrance. Because it is a municipal museum, the program of the City of Torrance Cultural Services Division of the Community Services Department, admission to the museum is free, but donations are accepted and very much appreciated. You can find the TAM on the web at www.torranceartmuseum.com. This discussion will be recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel with all of our previous TAMA talks. You can access it from our website, www.tamadvocates.com. Today's guest artist is James Gilbert, and I'll read from his bio to give a little background. This always sounds strange when I'm reading what you've written because I'm saying but it's your bio. So here we go. I have a multidisciplinary practice that includes sculpture, installation, drawing, video, and performance. Historical and contemporary narratives with longevity share commonality. They pose obstacles without resolution. My work reflects on these stories as an inspiration and acknowledges their role as a source of knowledge within societies. I often make work in large repetitive quantities because duplicating the process with slight variations often reveals an unexpected diversity of results. It resembles an anthropological study. From the large cross-section of ideas, I assemble thoughtful, empathetic awareness and appreciation of our influences and collective history. Then I start asking questions. How can I represent historical and contemporary issues? What materials best suggest these ideas? What form can I use to examine these narratives? I favor raw materials such as wood, industrial plastic sheeting, fabric, and plaster for the purity of their metaphorical meaning. For example, wood connotes time, aging, and rejuvenation, whereas plastic might be seen as fake and manufactured. I deliberately engage labor-intensive hand tools, which make the marks by my hand more evident. Every work carries the natural blemish of the materials and highlights intentional imperfections visible in joinery or the dangle of a loose thread. It gives away who we are, flawed and imperfect, which becomes a feature of the work. I choose to honor our sorrow, loneliness, and discomfort with respect, humor, and humility. I use witty forms and a lighthearted palette as a defense mechanism that transforms confounding topics into a more accessible visual presentation. While I believe people are inherently good, broken institutional structures create environments defined by strife. We find ourselves dealing with the anguish of daily news, ache of social and racial injustice, political divisiveness, income inequality, and environmental destruction. We must balance these challenges with innovative and healing scientific advancements, technological marvels, human capability for compassion, generosity, and goodwill. That is quite a bio. So I feel honored to read it. It's so evocative, really, of your work. And we're excited to hear about it today. And thank you for joining us. And thank you for sending your images to us. So we'll
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, we'll get started. So this first piece is, we did this to ourselves. And I'm going to have you talk about any aspect of it that you want. But the whole idea of that is the wax It's pigmented wax over the wood. Is it molded to that? What's the, how do you?
No, the wax is, just a technical part of how I'm making things is these are all hand carved large wood sculptures in multiple components, and I like to see the quality of the wood, but I'm also manufacturing a bit of the vibe of it by making it pink, and why I choose pink is specific. And so it's a process that I use that I don't know anybody else uses. I'm tinting the wax, and it kind of fills in a little bit of imperfections, but it also makes a really beautiful surface, but allows us to also see what's underneath, kind of like the pink.
I see. And the title.
The title, we did this to ourselves. When I was choosing work for this show, I had a series of a body of work that I've been making for many years here. And I went back to this period when Max and I originally started talking about the show and ideas. Was the last few years, I kind of felt, how my own body was resonating with the politics, the environment, world issues, news, health issues with COVID. I started feeling what that does to our bodies and some of the choices that we make, and we're responsible for our own choices, and certainly in our own country. And one perspective I had was, well, yeah, that happened, but we caused it.
Right.
And so this was kind of the idea that we twist ourselves up because we cause it, but then we also have to figure out how to correct it. So this is kind of like a call and response in its own piece. Who did it? How do we resolve it? Who was affected by it?
Absolutely. Yes. It all, as soon as you said it, it all makes sense. This idea that we really do twist ourselves up. I don't even know if it's without really realizing that we're doing it. I think we actually do realize it while it's happening, and then we're contorted and we're like, oh, who can get
Yeah, and it's true in our own lives that we don't notice a gradual change, but all of a sudden, if there's an immediate change, we can see that. So this is something in terms of it happened over several years, and we're like, wait a minute, how did we get ourselves here? Like, well, just like when you and I look at ourselves in the mirror, we don't really see that we're getting older, even though we know we're getting older. But then we see somebody that hasn't seen us in years, are like, oh, you look different. I didn't know your hair was gray now, or all of a sudden, because you don't have a reference point, you don't see the gradual change, it's immediate. And this is what that piece does. There's immediacy of, okay, wait, now I'm calling attention to what may not be seen in a gradual period.
Right. All right, I'm going to move on. Does not begin and end the way we see.
Very similar to the other piece. It's two perspectives that are opposing, but they're also kind of the left and the right foot, but they're opposing each other in an awkward position. The same idea of where we started is not where we expected it was going to go, but we also kind of caused it. This is all kind of an internal debate that we're having within ourselves.
And again, the same process, that wood, carved wood with the pigmented wax in pink.
Yes, and this one is even more evident. How you referenced in my bio that I leave the joints, I leave the imperfections. I could make something perfectly shaped and molded, but as I'm grabbing pieces of wood and I'm adding them to the sculpture, it makes sense because who we are flawed. So I like to see the joinery, and I like to see the bow tie joints, and I like to see the imperfections of how the wood is shaped. And I allow that to be a feature.
And the idea that you are a woodworker, as a, woodworking as a profession in and of itself, and then using that to create art is extraordinary in and of itself.
Well, I don't limit myself only to wood. It's something I've used throughout my entire career, but I allow the materials to be part of the symbol and the metaphor for what the work is about. And so as we kind of go through some of my history, I've done textiles, I've done sewing of plastic, I've used moldings. So the work has to be responsive to what I want it to be about. But I can say that I've been using wood throughout my entire career, and I've been specifically making wood carvings for about 7 or 8 years now.
Wonderful, wonderful. Are we taking the same risks?
This is a new one that I've made this past year, and the idea is how I'm referencing myself within my community, and how we're also make comparisons between ourselves and what am I doing in my life compared to my neighbor, my friend, or colleagues, or family members. And so the idea is, which I like the 3 that are in the show together, and they all have a call and response to an individual. But this one is, are we taking the same kind of risks? And is it good that we're taking the same risks? Or are we taking 2 risks that are completely beneficial or kind of dangerous to ourselves? And so you have the 2 different kind of opposing legs, and the left and the right, but they're different scales, and they're also getting twisted up, and they're having this interaction within the same piece.
Are these are all in gallery 1, the main gallery. Are they grouped together?
They're spaced out about 6 or 8 feet a piece, but they all are having a response to each other. And it's nice that they're having an interaction, because it's there's somewhat of a figurative take on them, but they're also kind of anamorphic and abstracted, which is a word I don't really use, but they have this energy that's getting twisted up. So I like that they're having a reaction to each other.
Yeah, they're kinetic in their stationariness, they're moving, but they're not. It's a very interesting effect. Hollow the bone.
A big part of what I've been thinking about in the last several years is our own personal history. And part of my dynamic is like, if I was going through this process of exploring my own ancestry, and I know obviously my parents, I know my grandparents, I never knew my great-grandparents. And I started doing the research, and most of us don't know more than 3 generations of our own family. And so I created this idea, is like, if we don't have 3 generations of our family history and knowledge, how could we really know world history? And then, of course, if we don't know our world history, we'll also have errors in judgment and the knowledge that we're making some of the mistakes over and over. So this to me is actually showing an ancestry within the same piece.
Ah, interesting. So is each circular section a generation?
Yeah, it could be. I've been looking at all kinds of woodwork and totems from different kind of.
Right, it's very totem-esque, right?
Yeah, and there's lots of different cultures that use a version of this. And so, it has a narrative to it. And so I wanted to allow that generational narrative to happen, but in a kind of very simple generational form.
Lovely, very nice. This is not in the show?
That is not in the show. That was a show that I did just this past fall in Dallas.
Okay. And this is not small. This is 47, it's almost 50 inches tall.
That's what I can say from looking at these images, and I've heard this many times when I kind of photograph them on these fairly kind of neutral backgrounds. The scale is misleading, but these are actually, most all of them are much larger than you would expect. And they have weight to them, they have mass to them, and considerable volume.
Sure, so very sculptural in that idea that they're
because the idea of sculpture is you have to interact with it. They're different than things that you can put flat on a wall. I want to be able to kind of view them in a physical space and walk around them. So I want them to be imposing. So they are much bigger than you would expect.
This is the piece I loved. My sense of humor is complicated by my personality. Loved the title, loved the composition. Can't wait to hear about it. Love the ears.
This is another thing. This is kind of it's a generational thing. It's talking about history, it's talking about education of our own history. But I also, when I make work, I can have a philosophy behind the piece, and I can have a background, historical background around the piece, but then I also have part of my own personality. And I know that certainly for me, you can have multiple ideas occurring at the same time. And then I started thinking about how we approach our own days. And I can have funny moments, I can have philosophical moments, I can have perhaps sad moments or reflective moments, and all those kind of lay into our personality. And so to me, this is almost a biography of how I think and how I have my ideas and how it affects my own kind of personality. And so I like to think that I have a sense of humor, but then other parts of my personality complicate that. So that's how I came up with the idea in terms of a larger philosophy too.
Right, right. And the pieces, the sculptural head pieces are wood.
They're all wood.
Yeah.
And everyone is carved to have their own unique personality. Obviously, with different orientations, have a different feeling with it.
And a different perspective, obviously, of the
Yeah,
pieces.
you know what? I really like to, you commented on the ears, and each head I make, I don't really go into it with a plan. I let the materials kind of dictate how it's going to be shaped.
Yeah,
Obviously, I have enough experience that I know how to get where I'm going to go. But I like that the ears are misshaped, or they're odd in perspective, or the eyes are not symmetrical, because we do have these flaws.
right.
And they do add to our personality, and I allow that to happen. I want that to happen.
Right, right. And for me, I think and maybe it is not an exaggeration, it could just be where my eyes are being drawn, but that idea that with the ears being somewhat more obvious, to me, it also lends to the idea that you're listening more intently.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that we have all these different senses that we can use in different ways, and I allow that to be an obvious part of these.
Yeah, okay.
Um,
Go ahead.
go ahead. You could say the title if you like.
Evening would bring its familiar strangeness. And I like this piece because you can actually see, at least hopefully on your end too, but you can actually see each, each curve of the blade as it's gone into the wood to curve the faces. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's really important how I'm making these, and they are, like you said in the bio, they are labor intensive. There are lots of hand tools. Each mark, thousands and thousands of little marks that are there, and I leave them there. Sometimes I'll sand things out smooth, but sometimes I will leave them as an important part of knowing that these were handmade. We live in a world that's so very manufactured and mass produced that things can be perfect at any time. So I'm actually going back to the original idea of things that are handmade, and you can see proof that they're handmade.
Yeah.
And what I like about this one, again, it's a relationship. And there was multiple things I was thinking about at the same time, but it's a forced relationship, how they're connected. And I do this very rudimentary hinge on it, and there's a pin in there that allows these to kind of have a movement, but at the same time they're permanently connected.
Sure. Interesting.
And I have to say on this one, I have a very active dream life. So there's also kind of a response to that. Not only is it a relationship with myself, it's a relationship to my own dreams, it's a relationship to my own world, a relationship to my own family members and partners. There's a lot happening when I make a piece like this.
Some of them are just leaving me speechless. A reasonable alternative solution to admire our problems.
This is kind of a combination of several things we've already talked about. I'm looking at a generational history. I'm also looking at, by the title, you can also, similar to the first one, how we are responding to our environment, what we caused, what we can correct. And this is very much a balance of ideas, a balance of personalities. It's also making historical references on the bottom lighter pink figure. I'm also making historical references to more traditional marble sculptures that you would see. But I'm adding my own perspective on it, how I'm balancing the heads, how I'm coloring the heads, and it's a perspective on how we approach our own lives and how we approach our own reasoning.
And that pink is, you know, you've used the pink in that particular shade of pink, the darker shade, in several of the other pieces, particularly the two that are at the museum currently. Do you mix that shade yourself?
Yes, it's a very specific shade that I have, and it's been a lot of trial and error because I'm making, it's not necessarily paint that I'm using. I'm actually, it's more of a transparency in terms of the stains that I'm using. And I like slightly different values of that, but it's common that I use pink because I'm thinking in terms of philosophies that sometimes are have a little bit of weight to them, but I also want to make them more approachable for myself and have an easier conversation around them. So I use that pink as a way to soften the conversation of something that has a little bit more weight to it.
Sure, sure. The Great Migration, an Age of Exploration. This is quite large, 69 by 19 by 13 inches.
This one, it is on scale. I mean, if you stand next to it, it's almost as tall as you. And again, I'm thinking about history. And on this one, I was thinking of history of thought, history of technology, scientific advancement, and how we kind of build our own layers of knowledge. But there's also a certain amount of pushback, let's say, or people that don't believe in a certain idea. And obviously that's part of why I'm using the hand, kind of a little bit controlling ideas. At the same time, we do have a history. And again, it's a very much of a totem-like figure. So we can see the narrative, the ancestry, but it's also about philosophy and technology through history and advancement.
And interestingly, based on what you were just saying about that pink color, although the hand is in a sort of a dominating position, the pinkness of it makes it less intimidating.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, when I was making this piece, it's interesting because I've used pink so often in my career that I can think in pink most all the time.
Yes.
And I see objects in pink, but this one, I just couldn't see it in pink. And it just didn't resonate as pink. And it didn't have the feeling that I needed it to have in terms of what I knew the piece was about when I was making it.
The totem portion couldn't.
Yeah.
Pink.
And
Okay.
so it sat in my studio somewhat completed. The carving was done, everything else was completed, but I hadn't added the color to it. And I made lots of sketches. I colored the sketches, I changed the sketches, and ultimately I settled on the black because that felt right in terms of our history, and the pink just didn't feel right. And when I painted it, it was a bold move. I just went for it, and it feels right with the piece now in terms of what I wanted it to be about.
It would be very interesting also to see it with, before you add the color. Is there a particular kind of wood you use?
You know, I use a variety of wood. Some work better than others. You know, strangely, I use avocado wood, I use basswood, I use linden wood. There's a variety that I use for different reasons. But really hard woods are difficult to work with, and they're difficult to get the details in.
Sure.
So I stay away from those.
Okay.
But this is still a massively heavy kind of piece by itself.
Yes, the hand, I will say the girth of the fingers does sort of give you an idea that it is it is heavy.
Yes.
The hand itself feels heavy on the head.
Yeah, that's, it's intended,
Yeah.
that we have a certain amount of controlling opinions in our lives, and that can kind of hinder advancement.
Right, right. The act of generosity and war.
I was thinking about public monuments, and
Ah,
and this has been going on in our lives for a long time, but it's became very topical in the last 5 or 6 years. And how we approach our monuments and the people that we admire, but sometimes those monuments of people that we once admired, all of a sudden we see that they're deeply flawed.
mhm.
And this is partly a monument to different kinds of people. And without being too obvious, the top is the positive monument to somebody that we would admire. They're put on a plinth, more traditional kind of stately, looking up at it. And the bottom part is, the title is The Act of Generosity in War, and it's the monument to the people that we may not know, or the people that are
Ah,
missing
okay.
because of war. So there's two types of people, the people that we admire. There's also people that we admire that are maybe missing from war, but there's like the conflict of the two different kinds of monuments that we make. And that's the relationship I wanted to have in the same piece.
Right, you made me think that's the very same train of thought when we were looking at the education with the desk and the chair and the desk, and that idea of history, but it also depends on from whom we're hearing the history.
Yes,
that predominantly to this monument piece.
That is a good point. Perspective really does change, and knowledge from that perspective can really change your perception of how you view, the work and, ideas and our experiences.
Everything, right? I mean,
Yep.
everything. Profound. All right, let's see if I can. Kneel.
I spend a lot of time really working on my titles, and sometimes they're a bit long, but I like the narrative on this one. But the reason I'm bringing that up is this is one of the more simple titles I've had in years. And this piece started as I was very much like the piece that's in the current show. I started with the feet, and I had a different idea for them, and they were doing this kind of another twisting body morphine figure. And as I kind of put them flat, and I saw them at my work table, I saw the bottom of the feet. And so it's strange if you see this one in person, but the top of the feet are really detailed, and there's lots of carving marks. But you look at the bottom, they're a little bit more simple, even though they're complete. And so when I put them on my table and I saw the bottom of the feet, all of a sudden it just meant something different to me. And this was, of course, when they were having a lot of political issues, we're having lots of riots, things were happening in the last few years. And so I saw the bottom of the feet, and there was a certain amount of vulnerability that I saw in that. And so I started reworking the whole concept of this piece. And to me, when I write kneel as the title,
Yes.
There's two options when you're kneeling. One, both are vulnerable, and one is, let's say you're kneeling in a more contemplative way. But then the other way, which are also vulnerable, is a more submissive way.
Right, like a supplicant. Right.
And we've certainly seen both, and they're very different perspectives on an experience. But I really like this one. And again, this is one where you can really see the joints and the hinges. It's intentional.
Yes. And I actually think, again, I don't want to try to zoom, but I think I can actually see some of the grain of the wood under the wax.
You can. I allow the transparency of the paint to happen. I want to be able to see the wood because I want to be able to see what it is. I don't want it to look like it's plastic or it's molded or manufactured. I want it to see that the natural living material.
And I was just going to say that word living. I mean, the fact that you're using living or formerly a piece of wood that was formerly alive to depict a human. And then that idea of, that translucency of the outer covering to show in the wood to show the pattern of the wood, but like the way our skin can show our veins and our arteries and our.
I like that perspective, how you brought to it. That's I like that. That's nice.
Yeah, it's really evocative. The modern doubt.
Same idea is that we're living with our own relationships, our environments, and becoming with multiple perspectives. And I like to have a little bit of playfulness in my perspectives. Obviously, this is a forced relationship. They're attached and they have no choice but to interact with each other. But at the same time, that big base, this is actually strangely another much larger than you would expect.
Yeah,
but they're
20
attached.
by 20 by 14. So 22 by 20 by 14.
Yeah, and this is one of those things that in terms of a perspective, if you would try to pick this up, this would have the weight of maybe 2 or 3 bowling balls easily.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So these have some serious weight to them. But what I did on this one, because it's a relationship and it's a forced relationship and it's a forced relationship with self, environment, other people, but I like to have a little bit of fun with it. And this one is curved at the bottom and it's fully rounded on all dimensions. So not necessarily people would do this in a museum or a gallery setting, but if you walked up to it and you pushed it, it would rock gently.
I was going to say, would it wobble a bit?
Yeah, and it kind of adds a sense of humor in terms of this relationship.
And tell me about the red ear.
I just wanted to change the perspective on who these people are and add a little bit of personality to this particular person.
Okay. It's very Siamese twinsy in my brain. All right. The authority. And I think this is what you use as in your signature block in your email. So it's a very interesting piece, very different than actually some of what you've shown us already.
This one is to me, it's very quiet.
Ah.
And the word authority, I think it maybe comes from everybody's own perspective, but what is the ultimate authority in our own lives? And there's a certain, let's just say it this way, there's a certain amount of finality to all of us. And that's when our lives end, that's the authority, that's our defining moment. We've already made our contributions to our societies at that point. And I just wanted a very quiet monument. I actually can't even admit if it's to myself or it's to other people, but I just wanted something kind of reflective of a moment in history of a life. And one thing I'll point out to this, I've never pointed this out to anybody, but on the bottom part, the orange piece.
Yes.
If you look at that negative shape.
Yes.
It's perfectly matches.
Ah, yes, it does. Correct. Yes. Wow.
So the idea that this head eventually can get lowered perfectly
Yes.
into this box.
Right. Yeah, this one more so than any of your others does have that finality death part of it, but the eyes are open, right? So yes. It's sort of death masky to me, but yes, that idea that the final bottom that we sort of associate with ends, right?
Yeah.
Will fit perfectly.
And I have to say, death is a common theme in art history, and it's something that we all address in our own ways. And certainly in the last several years, it feels like even the last couple of years, they even starting to feel distant to us now. But when we were in it, they didn't feel distant. They felt like, oh, this is how we're always going to be. But now we're kind of moving past it. But I think about that for myself. I think about that for everybody around me.
Sure.
and the finality of it and the aspect that it's going to happen, and how do we want to live our best lives. A lot of those things happen in my mind as I'm thinking through this piece or these kind of pieces, and so I'm hinting towards the future of who this person is with the box and where it gets lowered into.
Yes, it's sort of my brain is kind of tossing around this idea of either impermanence of permanence or permanence of impermanence. It's like this, which is it? But this idea that there's going to be an end. So yes, maximize the time that you have while you can make an impact, even though sometimes an impact, a death becomes its own kind of impact.
Yes.
That is permanent, like creates this this ongoing every single day emotion. Interesting. I think
Correct,
this is my favorite piece. And I think it is because you talked about that little cutout.
Yeah. Most people don't see that, and I've pointed it out only a few times, and I think it's just important to understanding this piece and how I've chosen the title and the history of my thinking on it.
And the four circular holes, are they, were they, you put them in?
A lot of the wood that I use, sometimes it has its own history.
Yes.
And I like having that history.
Sure.
There is a, the ceramic bowls in Japanese history where they're repaired.
Yes, with the
And you
gold.
can see the kind of the gold veining in it, and you can see
Yes.
the history. I sometimes use materials that have history. And I like to see the history. I like to retain the history, and I don't want to change that because it's a part of the object.
Sure.
And I use that in my own practice.
Yeah, very powerful. Are we a nation of these?
Again,
100 unique fingers on plinths. I looked at this much too quickly when I first saw it and thought it was something completely different. But now that I read what you've written,
you're not alone, and I've heard that. I can only imagine what you're thinking. But this is an idea. Again, I was also thinking about public monuments,
yes,
not different than the act of generosity in war, and that's why they're on a very traditional looking plinth-like figure. Again, it was like, who is responsible for our choices? Who is responsible for our ideas? Who's responsible for what happens in our environments?
Mm.
And so there could be lots of metaphors in this. Who's doing the finger pointing? Who's taking the credit? Who's taking the responsibility? And the idea conceptually on this one is, again, who we're making our monuments to in terms of our leaders and the people that represent us. Well, in the United States, the people that represent us are our U.S. senators, and there are 100 senators.
Right.
So it's not a casual reason I choose 100 because it's just a nice round kind of fulfilling number, or it seems like a lot. There's a specific reason I chose that. So I've chosen 100 different people that represent us. There's a variety. Again, I'm using different shades of pink to represent different kind of personalities and figures. They all have every single one of them is uniquely carved and different shapes. So this is something I imagine as a big public monument in terms of who we are as a nation and who's representing us. And the title is, Are We a Nation of These? And this is, are we a nation of the people that we choose to represent us?
Yeah. I also got this connotation of chess.
I've never thought about that, but I can certainly see that, and how we are maneuvering around each other, certainly manipulating each other within politics.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a nice idea.
Yeah,
I like when
I first saw it, yeah, it's kind of, and again, I looked at it very quickly, but yeah, I wasn't, and again, it really, like, is each individual base different as well?
Every single base is different.
Wow, okay.
So you can go through there and every single base will be unique. Every single finger will be unique. This is something that was very time consuming. Like you read my bio, I will make something in very large quantities and they'll take months and months to make. But it's important to understand the piece and the concept of the piece.
Yes.
It's interesting, without asking you what your initial thoughts were, I've heard before and can they have a certain kind of central context to it, or a sort of perversion context to it, but I also like the chess context to it that you just added. I hadn't heard that before. And I allow that to happen outside of what my intention is, as long as it's somehow related, that's okay.
Right, right. And the other piece, as I was looking at it more at length, is that technological biometric aspect, that when you say, are we a nation of these? It seems that with biometrics now, that seems to give us the access to, whether it's our phone or a keypad to get into a building or whatever it might be, the idea that we can use our finger and our fingerprint, our unique fingerprint, to access all sorts of things. And so
I like that perspective. It's another new one to me, and I do like that perspective and how we actually still have to have a human touch.
correct.
Interaction. It's
Right.
a cool idea.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. And again, the pink resonates. It would be very different if you chose a different color, right? But for some reason,
Well, I have to tell you, it's as thinking visually, when you're trying to represent our environment and our community, there's a very different context. If I would have chosen different colors on this, right?
right.
And there's a certain amount of latitude that I allow myself with pink, and because it's not a natural color in terms of who we are as people.
Right.
So it allows me lots of latitude for perspectives without defining a particular cultural group or personality or community.
Right, right. Interesting piece. Okay, so this is the piece that resonated with me. And I think you said, did you do something similar to this, or this? Did you do this for Nomad?
I did a version of this one.
Okay, okay.
And what I did on this one is called Social Foreclosure. And when I started this piece, and this is, like I said, I use materials that are related to what the work is about. And in this period of my career, which is about 10 or so years ago, I was sewing a lot of plastic. I was sewing pink plastic. I was sewing transparent plastic. And the idea behind that, I was dealing with a lot of social media ideas in terms of sharing our private information publicly.
Okay.
And I had been making in a series that I had made many objects. I was making these transparent pink underpants, clear underpants.
Yes, I saw, right. I saw them on your website.
And I've made, I like to say this, and I think the number is pretty accurate. I've made probably close to 3,000 of those.
Oh, wow.
And it was a series, again, I make a lot of objects and they all had their individual personalities and they all were very kind of elaborately kind of sewn with details and sequins and buckles and all kinds of things. And in that period, as I was thinking about how we're sharing our personalities publicly through social media, and obviously when social media was very new and we're exploring it, I was exploring those ideas. And so the next generation of that idea turned into this, which is social foreclosure. And I took the idea of beds, which is the same idea as the underpants. It would be our bedroom behavior, our private lives, our intimate lives, our behind closed doors lives. But then I also took the idea of this tent, which is also a bedroom, but it's also more nomadic. We can pick it up, we can move it very easily to new locations. So I take the idea of this nomadic bedroom in this strange metaphor of our private lives are now nomadic and they can be built and rebuilt and changed wherever we want them to be. So it's the idea of, again, private versus public. And I reintroduced this piece at Nomad, as I was thinking about how we're building these communities of private versus public lives, and we're almost building these larger cities, almost these skyscraper versions of these multi-level buildings. And then I started thinking about how that's not dissimilar to homelessness that we
Right.
have, certainly in Los Angeles and every other major city in the world.
Mhm.
And the idea, again, we're taking our beds, we're making them nomadic, but we're building large communities and structures for homelessness or houselessness people.
Right.
And they are becoming bigger than we want them to be, but we don't have any control of them. And so that's the idea that I translated from the original concept 10 years ago to just a couple of years ago. And I like how the idea transformed, even though the intention was different, but it can mean something different now that still has a certain weight and social context to it.
Yeah, there's an architectural feel to it for me as I looked at it, but I did, interestingly, I did get that shelter, because it wasn't
Yes,
just a bed, it was this idea that it was a tent in a bed,
yes,
a tent in a bed frame. So that sort of juxtaposition between homelessness, but a bed.
yes.
Yeah, really.
In the version that you saw of this one, it was slightly different because what I did, it's also how we think in our own lives. I made all these pieces very modular, so I can change them based on the situation or the location. So
Ah,
I can stack them 10 high, I can stack them 5 high, I can do
oh,
them
wow.
different ways. And so I've presented it in different arrangements based off of the architecture of where it's being presented. So I
Interesting.
like that it's modular because we live in a very modular, flat pack world at times too. And I
Yeah.
wanted that to be an option.
And the idea of the tent too, like I like tent sleeping. Like I like the idea of being surrounded by tent. I don't know, there's sort of a safety in it, but at the same time, it depends where the tent is.
Yes, right. And then in this particular instance, we're building these communities.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. Warnings and instructions.
I wanted to include this piece in terms of understanding who I am. This is something I did way back in 2010. This was the first museum show I had in the Dallas Contemporary Museum. And this was 9,000 square feet. Again, this was right before the tent piece we just looked at. There was a lot of sewing plastic, and I built this environment. And the idea is perception and how we choose the decisions in our lives is so strongly related to our own perception. And so this one was a plane crash site, and
Oh,
it's almost like a rescue. And I was referencing Raft of Medusa, the famous painting,
yes,
historical
okay,
painting.
yes, yes, okay.
And so the idea is, which that was obviously a disaster. But this one, the perception is it can be a disaster scenario, but it can also have a different outlook if you have a different perspective. So the rescue boats have a sense of humor to them. You
Right,
can
with
see in the
line.
foreground, there's like the slide, and then there's a basketball hoop, and then there's a seesaw on one, and there's like, so I allow what is your perspective, and the viewer can have their perspective. Like, is it a disaster? Is it more of a kind of fun rescue? And inside of this, which you can't really see, I made 23 different videos. I think I had 7, 8 different monitor screens, some projected, some hidden in the walls, some hidden inside the boats. And so this was, I like to include it because it was very much of a formative piece for me. It was a large installation. I included sculpture and video, sound, all kinds of different things. And I just think it's an important piece to understanding who I am conceptually as an artist.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's really interesting to see that migration. I'm not sure if migration is the right word, from heavy use of plastics to the use now of wood,
Right.
as you are aging and not understanding, as you're aging and seeing how those natural materials can, and again, so you're using plastic to denote non-human forms, whereas your later work uses the wood to denote the human form. I think it's really
Correct, that's perceptive. I like that. Yes.
transformative. I like it. I like it. Okay. Arrogance and evidence. Fantastic piece. I love this.
Thank you. This is a piece that it was one of the later pieces I made in this series, but I did several years of where I was taking the materials of paintings, canvas, ink, paint, and I was making sandbag type shapes. And the idea was behind that when I was looking at historical pictures, mostly during World War II and kind of disaster sites and things around the world, how we would use sandbags to protect an object, how we would to protect important architecture, or we protect maybe paintings during disaster or wartime. And the idea is that those walls of sandbags became the new symbol of what was behind them. And it became the new description of what was behind them in a way. So I liked using that concept, and I made several very large installations with hundreds and thousands of hand-dyed pink sandbags. So I took that same idea of what we're protecting in terms of monuments and objects, and I took it to outside and what we're protecting. We're protecting nature, environment, and we're having these conversations around what is climate change? Is it real? Is it not real? Is it science is real? What is our belief system? So I'm taking this idea of the protection, the sandbags are protecting an idea, but there's also a theatrical element to it. Instead of using actually a wall of sandbags, I made it more theatrical, meaning I printed it on vinyl.
Okay.
I built a large structure, I photographed it, I printed it, so now it has a theatrical kind of flat to it.
Sure.
And even the wall is built as the way as we do a theatrical flat. So I take this whole theatrics with it, and I bring the theatrics outside in terms of what we want to protect. And I engage in kind of, the destruction of the earth in front of it, but also this very beautiful scenery
Behind it, right. And also that excavated dirt that you chose to leave it there. Rather
Yes.
symmetrically around it. But you're saying that the a previous iteration of this you actually created the sandbags themselves.
Yes, very large, heavy structures where I'd be building entire structures and buildings inside. These sandbags would be 30 inches long, kind of like real size sandbags that we'd see, but each one was hand-dyed, hand-colored, built into a form. So anybody wants to see that can go kind of dig into my website.
Yes, I will be sure to include a link. So these last few structures are very different than what we saw at the beginning, but they are recent. So this is how much earth for sale done in 2022. And I think I'm just going to go through really quickly. We can come back. I think I wound up putting 2 on a
Perfect
slide, but is this the first one, as it were?
Yes.
Okay.
I think important part of and I want to include these because a big part of my practice is I don't make the same object over and over, but I work on ideas. And I was making this at the same time as I was making the sculptures that are included in the current show. So ideas happen in the same way. Ideally, I'm thinking historically, ancestry, philosophies. A big concept that I like a lot that I've been incorporating into my work is there's a principle, it's called the 7-generation principle. And the idea is every decision that we make should be in mind in the thoughtfulness of how it will affect the next 7 generations of our ancestors. So it's a kind of beautiful kind of concept.
Of our descendants, so like after us.
Yes, after us.
I see.
So
okay.
Decisions that we're making have to be thoughtful.
Sure. And
Okay,
then,
and not so self-serving.
right.
And I incorporate even to those the current wood carvings that I'm making. So this piece I was invited to do last year in terms, it was called the Foreground Biennial, Midwest Land Art Biennial. And the concept behind the show was how we are dealing with land and water rights issues on land. And I wanted to have a historical approach to it. So this is a rammed earth wall that bisects a house. And rammed earth is considered a very old building material, thousands of years, when you take its earth and you compress it until it's rock hard. And these buildings last for thousands of years. So I'm taking a very old building material and technique, but I'm incorporating it into something now. And the idea is we take this home and it's divided by our history of a very old building material, and the entrance is blocked, the exit is blocked. So we have this, metaphorically, we have this house divided at the same time.
Yes.
And then the house itself, just in terms of how we're thinking metaphorically, I use the game Monopoly, those little hotels and houses on there. I use the ratio of one of those pieces for this. I'm basically taking the idea of monopoly and how our own government had monopoly of our own government land, and how it took land, assumed land from different cultures and communities,
Right.
and took ownership of it. So the house is reflective of the ratio of the monopoly house. And now I'm taking a very old historically technique in terms of the earth building, and that's dividing the house.
Wow. It reminds me of a piece that you'd see out in Desert X, out in Palm Springs,
Yes.
those land art pieces out there.
Yes.
So you have here parenthetically seasonal slides. And so these next two, is this the same structure?
This is the same piece, and
Okay.
the reason I included lots of these is because this piece is there for 2 years,
Okay.
and I thought it'd just be fun to include it living in its own environment and how it's changing within its own environment. So this group of slides is over the past year in
Okay.
the same location.
So same location, just different seasons.
Yes, exactly.
And where is it with the snow?
This piece is located just north of Minneapolis.
Oh my, okay.
The place is called Franconia. It's a 50-acre sculpture park, museum, artist residency area.
It's I'm a huge fan of the Roy Lichtenstein house at the what is it, in the sculpture garden at the National Gallery in DC. And it's very evocative of this it's maybe just in the structure, I don't know, but it's making
what I like about this is conceptually I put a lot of thought into it. I did a lot of research related to land art laws and historically building techniques, but it's also very simple to look at.
Right. Again, kind of like you were saying, that simplicity that is incorporated into it belies the fact that it does have so much intricacy and, like you said, a lot of research and discovery behind it. And the whole idea of the ratio of the is it a hotel? The hotel
The
piece
hotels or the houses, yes, I was referencing those. I actually took those out, measured them, and started to, and I just wanted to see the edge of it, because we don't need to see the whole thing. We need to be able to see through it. We need to see our own history. We need to see the environment through it.
Nicely done. And you created these at the same time that you were doing the pink pieces, the wood pieces.
Yes.
Outstanding. Fantastic. I'm so pleased that you that your work has been included in the TAM show. And we're hoping one of the major reasons why we do this, well, two, is what we still have some folks who are unable to get out to museums, so we'd like to highlight some of the artists. And I also think that by providing some background for people, but when they go into the museum, so if they were to watch this before they went into the museum, they would have a greater understanding than what's on the label, and be able, I think, to spend, my goal always with contemporary art, with any art actually, is for the viewer to stand in front of the piece longer than it takes them to read the label.
I agree with that completely. And you know, and these concepts, you know, sometimes when you go see a group show, it's easy to, you know, just quickly go through it and not spend time with it. But I really do appreciate all of us have a different process of how we make work, but my process is very research heavy. And it's also making heavy and material heavy and concept heavy. And by allowing to have our discussion, it puts some of those few pieces more in a context of why I'm making what I make versus just an object in a show. So it's helpful to understanding how I'm thinking throughout my career.
Yes, absolutely. And again, although the visitors to the TAM will miss out on it, I think that by showing those earlier plastic works, you know, you actually do see that. And again, I'm hesitant to use the word progression because it sort of intones that, you know, what you did before is not as good as what you're doing now. And that's not the case at all. It's just this a different interpretation of the life that you were living at the time.
Well, that's the truth, isn't it? We all kind of change, we all grow, we all develop, we all decide we have different goals and different contributions we want to make to our communities and our societies, and that's part of who we are. I'm not going to be one of those guys that makes the same painting for 40 years, because my thoughts develop, and as my metaphors and themes need to develop.
Right. It is a bit of an evolution, right, over time. So
yes,
I have one more slide, which is just a thank you for joining us today. We really, really appreciate the added knowledge. And I think that hearing, short of us being able to include every artist for every walkthrough, you know, even when Max or one of the other curators does a walkthrough for the docents or for TAMA members, or, you know, for members of the public who choose to come in and have a guided tour, that's still his interpretation of what he knows about your work. By hearing it from you specifically, it gives everybody, you know, there's a definicy, that's not a word, but there's this idea that there's a truth to what's being told because you're explaining it.
yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.